Dear friend, apparently the time has come, the time when the scattering of men's voices has reached completion and a large force believes the lie over the truth. True, humans have been quite cyclical in their mannerisms since we lost the one language, and history has shown us similar times with similar tyrants rising and falling. But today, in our very era, we will surpass ourselves by reaching the top of the self-destruction pinnacle, followed by nature's response or the wrath of God, as some believe. All this will be accompanied by what appears to be a fulfillment of a prophecy in the Revelation section of the Bible. In September of this year, 2017, a conjunction of the stars and planets will take place, a conjunction which occurs every 5,000 years or so. Because of this, I suggest you look up this phenomena and incorporate it into your psyche in your own unique way. As with all bits of information available everywhere, I also suggest you view at least three different authors before drawing a conclusion. As tomorrow may not come, I feel it imperative I set free a secret that is based in logical truth. This message is both to forewarn you of possible ripples in the normal waves of life and to forearm you with the knowledge you yearn to discern. There is no time to go into details about things, but there is enough time to go into her story, the history that time forgot but can be woven together like a quilt of truth. You already know the story, it's just been twisted with time, making it a bit unrecognizable. Her story truly begins after she, Cleopatra, and Antony lost the Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC against Octavian of Rome. Afterwards, for the most part, Cleo stayed home while her husband, Antony, went out fighting smaller battles before he came back to Egypt feeling utterly defeated. Being a highly intelligent woman, Cleo would have known time was of the essence because Octavian would soon arrive to accept their surrender. This most likely meant being paraded in front of the crowds in Rome in a subjective manner before being killed, as was customary with captured high-ranking enemies of Rome. In the end, she had 11 months to come up with and execute a Plan B. It is my contention or theory that Queen Cleopatra of Egypt did not fully die on August 12, 30 BC, as historians claim she did. It is my belief she poisoned herself just enough to appear dead, only to be revived after her death was officially declared. This happened either by the effects of the poison wearing off or by an antidote being administered by a loyal friend like Nicholas of Damascus. The unknown cocktail of her choosing was likely one she became very familiar with while practicing on slaves and prisoners, as history tells us. There was probably an ample supply in the location of her experimentation room, and I'm sure her herbologist helped her figure out the timing, both in how long it took before death came and how long before either the effects wore off or when the antidote was needed to be administered. Logic dictates the side effects were notated as well. Whether other vials were stored in the room of the house where she was confined by Octavian after Antony's death, or if it was given to her when she visited Antony's crypt by a friend, or if it came in the legendary basket of figs the reported snake came in, is neither here nor there. She could have ensured all three locations or actions were both viable and in place before Octavian's arrival. She was a highly intelligent lady, and Egypt was her playground. Egypt was her home. Part of her plan was to force Octavian to play on it as she played by her own rules. Once the poison she ingested had taken effect and she was officially declared dead, news of her death would have spread like wildfire amongst the common folk who loved her. Similar in fashion to how people reacted to Kennedy's assassination in his time. Octavian would have been mentally twisted with rage, first at her unexpected death, thus taking away part of his glory of killing her himself in front of all of Rome. Second, perhaps a day or so later, when Clio taught him the true meaning of checkmate with her unexpected resurrection and escape. Like water held in a cup made of hands, she seeped through his grasp, leaving his jaw dangling in disbelief. Do you see how this could anger the man in charge of recorded history? Imagine how he tried to suppress the news of her escape in Egypt so it would never reach the shores of Rome. He was outsmarted, outwitted, and outnumbered in loyal friends, and by a woman no less. He couldn't let the plebs or the general public know this, so he most likely destroyed any documentation about her and killed anyone who disagreed with him. I believe if Octavian had had her body, dead or alive, he would have paraded her to the crowd, but instead he used an effigy. One more bit of circumstantial evidence that leads me to believe she didn't really die, and a legend was born. I doubt you've researched Clio the way I have, so let me let you in on a few things. For the good or bad of it, while the poisonous experiments were taking place, Clio and sometimes Anthony would dress up like commoners and walk the streets. In my view, this would have been a portion of her Plan B, and these excursions served as a trial run so she could learn how to appear average and blend in, hide in plain sight, as it were. She was also known to speak at least 8 languages, and was the only one in her family who could speak and read ancient Egyptian. It was expected of her to be highly educated because she was the pharaoh's daughter. These studies would have included religious studies concerning the goddess Isis, of which she became high priestess for, and later still became the human incarnate of. Unfortunately, this part is often overlooked or scoffed at by scholars due to the brainwashing of modern-day belief systems. The equivalency in modern-day terms might be stated as, she was the Pope of Egypt who was loved across the known world. The Pope who had certain spiritual knowledge mixed in with scroll-reading knowledge from all lands, mixed in with various language knowledge, mixed in with ruling vast lands knowledge. She was a formidable force, a force who forced her way onto the scene by remaining behind the scenes, at least after her death. Brilliant she was, absolutely brilliant. For brevity's sake, I shall touch on just a few examples of what the goddess Isis meant to the ancient Egyptians and later the Greco-Romans. Isis was known as she of 1,000 names, or 10,000 depending on your source. Basically, she was a multitasking goddess. For each skill or requirement made of her, she had or used a different name. So instead of being called a plumber and an electrician, she was Weret Kekau, the great magic, because of her power, or Ament, the lady of the underworld, or Kut, giver of light, at the beginning of the new year, and so on. She was known as a healer and had the ability to battle evil by casting spells. She was considered a protectress who placed others' interests and well-being ahead of her own. And the Book of the Dead described the goddess Isis as she who gives birth to heaven and earth, knows the orphan, knows the widow, seeks justice for the poor, and shelter for the weak. Like Isis taking on attributes of other goddesses over her 3,000-year evolution, some of her attributes became part of the Christian belief system when it first came into existence. Many of the terms used to describe the Virgin Mary were actually epitaphs for Isis. For example, Mother of God and Queen of Heaven. I encourage you to look these things up. The more you seek, the more you'll know. This was a huge part of who Cleo saw herself to be, which can help clarify your understanding of her. Other facts about Cleo include the Alexandria Library being her playground, study hall, and quite possibly her classroom as a child. She spoke with, learned from, and was advised by masters in their field. Masters so highly regarded, people across the world would come, as they had for centuries, to learn from them. Perhaps Cleo spoke with the foreigners too, adding more nuggets to her knowledge kaleidoscope. One of the books most likely in this library would have come from the King of Pontus, Mithridates VI. He watched over Cleo's father and brother when they were boys in exile and wrote a book on poisons and antidotes, a book Cleo possibly read since it was customary to include a copy or the original of all books in the Alexandrian library. This book may have helped her decide which poisonous recipes she should refine for her Plan B. Cleo was unique. As an analogy, most of Cleo's relatives had a Greek major and an Egyptian minor, whereas she had an Isis priestess major, Egyptian minor, and a Greek sub-factor nature as to who she was. There is no evidence that she, nor any of her family members, were suicidal, however. As we can see by the results of barely being able to see much of her documented history, she must have angered Octavian so bad with her Plan B, he tried to erase the true events from history. One of the wonderful things about life is, history, in the memory of the human mind, is not so easily extinguished, especially because of the time frame in which these events occurred. Stories were the commoner's form of everyday entertainment. They are live-action soap opera, as it were. As always, the best stories lingered. The best stories during certain periods could get you killed. The best stories were kept alive by going underground. And the best stories morphed. And this one did, big time. Everyone has heard about it, but no one knows it, or at least does not understand its origins, so everything they know is taken out of context. This would be okay to Cleo, the human incarnate of Isis, though. It just added one more name to the thousands of names she already held. Now that you can ponder the validity of my theory of Cleo faking her death, you might ask, what does this theory have to do with my actions today? Simple. If you can ponder the thought of Cleo not dying, then perhaps you can ponder what she might have done afterwards. If my theory is correct, she realized for the sake of her surviving children, who were now in the custody of Octavian's sister, Antony's Roman ex-wife, she could only be an annoyance to Octavian to minimize the hardships for them ahead. Cleo knew all too well how his public persona hid his private life of depravity. To help you understand this, look at the fruit or actions of his adopted stepson, Tiberius. Tiberius, who learned from dear old daddy, went mental while ruling and brutalized whomever he chose. Like all cyclical things, Tiberius then taught these mad skills to Caligula, who then taught these skills to Nero, the man who burnt down part of Rome. A cycle always starts somewhere or with someone, and Octavian was that someone. This was the reason Cleo dare not attack him in a customary way. but customary was never Cleo's style. Being dead, yet alive, was a lifelong irritation for him, so any other annoyances were a bonus. Octavian did do things to try and antagonize her, though. Still fueled with rage, he continued his propaganda machine against her, crucifying her with words long after her death. 3 years later, he changed his name to Emperor Augustus. They say it was to mark his victory against Cleo, but in truth it marked the month of her death. This month was previously known as Sextilius to the Romans, for the 6th month. This is how August got its name. By the way, Julius Caesar created the Julian calendar due to inspiration from Cleo and Egyptians. Our current calendar is a variation of that calendar. Octavian was also keenly aware that this month was special to Cleo because in Egypt it marked the start of their new year and contained many religious connotations. Luckily for her, she had another name on her list of enemies. She knew causing issue for him would cause an annoyance for Augustus as well. After her defeat and his finagling, Herod the Great was now in control of her former prosperous lands in Judea. He used any money he found in any of her former Judean abodes and the money from the lucrative crops on those lands, along with money he acquired by taxing the Hebrews, to build. True, he built the second Hebrew temple, but this was just a way to make him look better, as were most of his other buildings. Some were in tribute to Caesar, and others were fortresses built out of his paranoia. Paranoia, I believe Cleo helped amplify with her many skills. Personally, I think Herod had no faith in anything other than money and the feeling of superiority. Sound familiar? Whether Emperor Augustus informed Herod about Cleo still being alive is speculative. I think he didn't, because it would have made him appear weak. I am sure he informed Tiberius, his successor and adopted stepson, though. The plebs or general public may not have been aware of Herod's disturbing personal nature either, but Cleo knew. Antony had had many common leadership meetings with him and momentary agreements. Before the loss at Actium, Herod was allied with Antony. Afterwards, he joined up with Octavian. Having no army or husband or lands and on the run from Rome, Cleo could only do what she knew how to do to ensure his uncomfortableness in living. She relied on loyal friends and confidants such as Nicholas of Damascus, who once taught her children and was now prime minister and court historian to Herod, and the mother of Herod's wife, Alexandra, who long held a friendship with Cleo. These folks kept her informed, all while protecting her hiding location. Like me, Cleo knew she had no control of others being in control, but she wasn't about to make it easy for Herod either. Everyone knew his mental capacities were bent, but people started to witness the angle grow more twisted shortly after he sided with Augustus and had his wife, Mariamne, killed. Mariamne was a true Jewish princess who was like a trophy to him. Marrying her was a way for him, in his eyes, to legitimately incorporate himself into the Jewish community. It didn't work out as well as he hoped. Most of the Jewish community did not like him, and their disdain grew after he killed Mariamne under the false accusation of adultery. Her mother and sister did testify against her, but there's a good chance they were trying to save their own lives. There is a high probability that Augustus had a secret role in the events that took place, because to me, it sounds like something he would do. Long after Herod killed her, it is reported he continued to hear his wife's voice. According to some, this drove him madder with time, because a part of him truly did love her. Or was that the real case of what happened? This is where having a bent mind, like mine, comes in handy. The real case for me comes from my real estate of mind, insanity, and I own it. It is my contention Cleo, aka the goddess Isis, tortured Herod with her invisible skills she learned as high priestess, one of which included knowledge of the one language. In simple terms, she used what could be considered ESP. Having this skill plus many others, she sent his dead wife's voice into his head to overwhelm him with guilt. You may jest, but think about it. It is a lot easier to mimic another person's voice in your head than it is to do so out loud. And if you have ESP, well, the possibilities of sending voices can be limitless. This can all be traced back to the multifaceted beliefs the ancient Egyptians held concerning the heart, possibly the most well-known of which is the weighing of the heart ceremony after death. It is when the heart of the deceased is weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the Egyptian word for balance, in the Hall of Truth. If your heart was lighter or equal to the feather, your soul would go to heaven, which, to the Egyptians, was a slightly better version of Egypt called the Field of Reeds. But if it was heavier than a feather, it was thrown to the floor and devoured by the god Amenti. Once the heart was eaten, the soul would cease to exist. There was no hell for the ancient Egyptians. Their fate, worse than death, was non-existence. Apparently, Cleopatra's heart did not get eaten. Her name still resonates wonder around the world. Her Ma'at is strong. I believe it is written or translated that the ancient Egyptians believed the heart was where the mind was, and in a certain one-language weighing of the heart ceremony type of way, this is true. But for the average person, I think the more appropriate thought would be the heart is the gateway to the mind. If someone can feel or sense the weight of another person's heart, they too could access the mind of the individual. To personalize it for you, think about a time when you knew or felt something concerning a family member out of the clear blue. Your heart was pinged and your mind knew instantly. Good or bad as it may have been, you knew you needed to contact that person immediately. That is a heart connection, or a connection to their heart gate, if you will. The one language concept I speak of is more than a certain set of letters or symbols used to express a language. The one language is a communication ability between humans that does not require a single word be spoken. If you're lucky and honest, you have had at least one person in your life you could connect with like this. Love is the key. Time ravages all knowledge if it is not practiced and advanced. Science tells us we are all one at the subatomic level, just as some religions tell us we are all one. With these thoughts in mind, you can see how the one language concept works because we generally understand ourselves pretty well. Since Cleo considered herself to be Isis, aka the goddess of 1,000 names, one of which was the goddess of the underworld, oWn, Cleo could feel the weight of someone's heart feather. Basically, she could tell the difference between good people and bad people by sensing the weight of their heart. And to protect the innocent, Cleo must have felt it was her duty to wreak havoc on those whose hearts were heavy and would continue to cause harm. To Cleo, Herod was just such a person. She may have started her invisible ESP torment work on Herod as a request from her friend Alexandra, Herod's mother-in-law, or for the simple benefit of the people. Either way, I believe her invisible methods wore him down. It got to the point Alexandra of the Maccabee was about to declare him unfit and take charge herself. Sadly, when she tried this, his competitive nature revived him, and he had her killed in 28 BC. After this, I believe Cleo had to adapt. She knew some of the things were out of her control and had to happen for a reason. She knew she had to stop worrying about Herod and start figuring out what direction she should take her life. She knew she was a born leader, but now she had no one to lead and nowhere to lead from. During this time, I think she remembered reading about the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians who were known to wander from place to place, exchanging their wisdom and medical knowledge for room and board. I believe she decided to follow their lead. And by taking their lead, she became a leader in the trend to come. It was during this time that I think Cleo realized faking her death caused the old Cleo to die, but it also provided the opportunity for the new Isis to live. It is written that Cleo was known to be a skilled conversationalist. Speaking multiple languages helped this talent, I'm sure. As a house guest to her various hosts, Cleo could have easily added to any of the various topics her hosts decided to talk about. Perhaps some of the conversations she partook in were about the wonders of Egypt and the goddess Isis, or perhaps the talk was about the rumors of her death. True, she couldn't reveal who she was for their sake and hers, but she could have partaken in the conversation. She could have heard new things and adjusted their story by saying, "Well, I heard." Or perhaps the conversations were about things in the Torah. The Torah is the Hebrew Bible, aka the first part of the Old Testament of the modern Christian Bible, if you didn't know. This book was translated into Greek upon her relative's directive hundreds of years before Cleo was born, which makes me think it was a part of her learning structure as a child. The translation work was done at the Library of Alexandria. Logic dictates there should have been at least 2 copies of the Torah in the library, a Greek version and a Hebrew version, both of which I'm sure Cleo could read. Whether she wanted it or not, her reputation as a healer and a conveyor of wisdom grew. Granted, this took a long stretch of time and covered a long stretch of ground, but the roots of her reputation were strong. Her unique understanding of the Torah may have enhanced her reputation enough to draw the legendary wise men from the East, who wanted to visit the new king of the Jews, the person who spoke wisdom of the Torah like never before. Or perhaps it was Cleo who sent for them in random form, via old contacts and information pipelines, and told them to stop by Herod's to ask about the new king. She could have done this to increase his paranoia even further. All of this is speculation drawn from logical possibilities and documented evidence. What we do know for sure is something written 2,000 years ago, some 50 to 100 years after the events took place. There is bound to be errors in the story and in the interpretation of the story. In this particular case, the writers of the New Testament recorded a legend which had been regaled from town to town by the common folk based on a common rumor that would not go away, a legend that had already verbally mutated, partly due to traveling traders and towns with taverns, taverns with drinkers and townfolk talkers who were there or had a friend of a cousin who was there when the events took place. The meat of the legend was still true, but the potatoes were overcooked, undercooked, boiled, fried, mashed, baked, seasoned, sautéed, and sectioned off. By the time her life after death story was written, she became a he, and some of the components went missing. Not to mention translating it from one written language into another, all of which equated to another form of mutation. Curiously, if during her time on the run, Cleo chose to use the name Isis, she could have pronounced it in one of the ways it is said to have been pronounced in ancient Egyptian, as a form of remembrance to her former life. This pronunciation was Isis, if I say that properly. If word got back to Augustus about Isis, his competitive nature would have kicked in, and so would have his paranoia, because he most likely would have known the true identity of Isis. This was probably the first verbal version of Jesus' name, hence the reason there is very little documentation about both of these people in history. They were one in the same. Meow, says the Cheshire Cat. The letter J wasn't invented until the 1600s. Look it up. Like the Spanish name Jesus being pronounced Hey Zeus, but spelt like the English name Jesus, meow, spelling means nothing in verbal conversations. This is the secret Octavian, aka Augustus, tried so desperately to hide, and this is why her legend is so strong. It takes years and years for a legend to survive and grow. It wasn't just her time spent with her ministry, but the time that came before it as well. It was the totality of who she was that got her story written. It was her ability to back that ass up by doing miracles, aka Egyptian magic, speaking heartfelt wisdom and healing that helped her legend grow. And whether he knew it or not, Augustus's hate for her made the people love her even more. She was his nemesis. And the more he hunted her, the more she was loved. The people saw Augustus's violence while they witnessed or heard about her love for all the people. Her story also demonstrates the intense faith she had that someday there would be someone who would read through the reeds and see the truth of how a legend was born from death. Subsequently, this is what the church tried to hide if they knew it existed at all. This is when the war on love took a new world-changing twist. While those with no understanding continued to breed hate for what their Caesar hated based on lies, insecurity, and fear. A hate which has reinfested itself upon the world, of which the only cure for is us. Yes, this may insult your senses, partly because you can't believe it to be true, and partly because you do. Algebra can't be learned in one day, and neither can learning something extraordinary like this. Some things have to be soaked in with time. I am not here to convince you, I am only here to inform you. Perceive it as you will. I am not a politician, I am not a protester, I am a history hound who has a spiritual nature. I do not have the grace and knowledge of Cleo, nor the high priestess that came before and inspired Cleo to do what she did, but I do feel this ma'at, this truth, needs to be said, both for your benefit and mine. This brings me to what you've been viewing. Like Cleo hating the subhuman Herod, I do not care for the schmimy one who thinks he is sitting on America's throne and can spend our money like Caligula of Rome to go golfing or to protect his adult children on his business trips, not to mention his destruction of why America began in the first place. She was created for the people, by the people, not for the people in office or the ones buying their influence. Like Herod, the whiny bitch boy-in-chief did not want his position to help the people. He did it to bring glory to himself. This is a portion of my old school plan, or I guess I should say a part of my ancient school plan. This is one stone in a path that must be laid out properly, including physical conduits, mental and spiritual intention, as well as honorable requests from me to the wind and my ancestors. My ancestors, another reason why I am the only one that can do this. True, there are many who have ancestors who helped form this country, but none with my knowledge. Sometimes knowing what I know makes me feel like I am the who some are looking for, and at other times I feel like I'm a joke in the eyes of those whose pineal gland has solidified. Such are the reasons I must battle with an ancient invisible sword. Both sets of folks remain true to their perspective, and both may be correct in their assumption, but for what I see will happen to the little people and to the earth itself, because of the wackadoodle in chief, I must do this. I resist the oligarchy. I resist the tyranny. I resist the mental incapacity of those in charge. So like Cleo causing mental strife to a leader who was a fraud, and like my ancestors who fought against tyranny, I feel it is my responsibility to wreak havoc on the snake oil salesman-in-chief in our time. Mind you, like Cleo, I must have the guidance and permission from the wind to be successful. If the wind did not approve, nothing would happen. This serves as a warning to those who think they can do things willy-nilly. The wind can read your heart and will wreak havoc on you if your intentions are not approved. Personally, I believe the wind and life has groomed me for this very thing. As you've witnessed, I visited my ancestor's grave in colonial Williamsburg. Colonel John Page came to this country in 1650 and is one of her uncommonly spoken of founding fathers. His great-great-grandson and namesake was friends with Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and many, many others. With a candle-lit lantern, I prayed and begged for his assistance in getting rid of our modern-day tyrant-in-chief. I asked him to call his son and his son's sons, and so on down the line, as well as their friends. I told him I needed their help. America needed their help. When I was finished, I took a small bit of dirt from his gravesite. I don't have loyal friends like Cleo had on the inside to help me, so I have to rely on the randomness of strangers and spirits on the wind. I do have many skills, both learned and naturally given, that can and will cause a disturbance in his evil force, as it were. I don't know the total outcome, as in his reactions to my actions, hence my warning and in the beginning, but I do know my actions will cause an effect. Effects like the one that has already happened as I edit this story. The paranoid Caligula wannabe-in-chief closed the sidewalks around the southern side of the White House. Let me see him bar the wind or the footsteps of everyone. Besides which, by the time he hears about this story and my actions, it will be too late. My plan will have already taken root. A few of these ash-infused wax balls have a great potential to end up on the shoe of someone going to the White House. With each step, a tiny smear of the wax and me will be left behind everywhere they go. True, cleaning crews are great, but molecules are better. I will smile as I ponder, where will these peeps walk that I could never reach? Once the remnants of death, aka my burnt hair, my ancestors' gravesite dirt, and the wax of intentionality is placed around the White House, the remaining modern spirits who have lingered will pick up on the scent. Once their senses are piqued, they should be able to pick up on the intentionality of my prayer, which will encourage them to send out the call for the rest of the White House ghosts who have been slumbering through this nightmare. Because of DC's long history, and even if some of the wax balls don't make it inside the White House, there are bound to be ghosts roaming the streets nearby. They can be of assistance as well. These ghosts will help serve multiple purposes, the first of which will be annoyances at all hours of the night. Things will move or disappear, voices or sounds will happen, or the wackadoodle will simply get a chilling feeling that travels with one being haunted. They will watch him day and night. Unfortunately for the snake oil salesman in chief, some ghosts like to attach and linger. It's hard to remove a needy-greedy ghost, no matter where you roam. They get attracted to similar thinking beings and don't want to let go. Another reason will help enhance my heart gate senses to the bleached marmalade's emo state, or of an impending doom, or for random updates. Oh, didn't I tell you? I can talk with dead people. Cliché, I know, but true. My Gramps was the first dead person I ever touched, but he was not the first one I spoke to. He just solidified the knowledge of this talent I have. Apparently, ESP, aka the one language, does not end at death, nor is it limited unless it's blocked by the sender or sendee, which can be hard to do if you can't see it coming. And at the same time, there are just certain things I don't want to know. That's phase 1. Phase 2 consists of letting the wind carry shards of my hair, preferably in and around the White House or on unsuspecting individuals walking through the hair breeze as they enter the White House. Either way, hair is known to get everywhere. Just ask a fuzzy pet parent. Once accomplished, my invisible physical penetration will be complete. I will be everywhere, and my torture for the ignorant emperor and his invisible new wardrobe will begin. I don't really need all these props or help from the dead, but the help will help me remember this is not about me. This is about all the people of this country, both now and before the days it first began. And sometimes the dead think of things I would never conceive of, so that's a bonus. History does not have its eye only on those in charge, but it is also viewing those who walk around unknown. If I see something wrong and do nothing, then I am just as bad or wrong as the robber in chief. As long as I am ma'at, or balanced with truth, I have no fear. Signed with true love and wondrous curiosity, leading to the insanity of your friend, B.A. Page. Remember, B.A. Page in your own history. My next letter will contain the results of my experiment if you did not notice them for yourself already. Cheers! P.S.S. If you are not my friend and think my death will end what I began, you are sadly mistaken. My death will only magnify my intentions, because then I'll be on the other side. Peace.